The acrid stench of whiskey hung in the air as Pearl Foster stumbled backward, her spine colliding with the rough-hewn bar. The three men surrounding her wore expressions that chilled her blood colder than the Montana winter waiting outside the saloon doors. It was 1876, and in the frontier town of Broken Creek, a woman alone might as well be wearing a target on her back. "I told you, I don't have your money," Pearl said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. She tugged her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders, acutely aware of how the threadbare fabric betrayed her desperate circumstances. Lyle Jenkins, the largest of the men, leaned in close enough that his whiskey-soaked breath made her eyes water. "Your daddy's debt don't just disappear 'cause he got himself killed, girl. Someone's gotta pay." "I've got nothing," Pearl replied, her green eyes darting around the saloon, searching for a sympathetic face among the dozen or so patrons. She found none. "The farm's gone, everything's gone." Jenkins exchanged glances with his companions. "Well now, that ain't entirely true. You still got one thing worth trading." The smile that crawled across his face made Pearl's stomach twist into knots. "My wagon needs a new wheel," said the shorter man, Emmett Doyle, eyeing Pearl with a calculating gaze. "Reckon this one might be worth about that much." Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs. "You can't just can and will," Jenkins cut her off, "unless you got a better offer." "Anybody here want to pay more than a wagon wheel for this one?" He grabbed Pearl's arm, yanking her forward as he addressed the saloon. Going once. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of snow-laden wind and a tall figure in a long duster. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Pearl could see eyes the color of a summer sky studying the scene before him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to handle trouble, going twice. Jenkins continued, his grip tightening painfully on Pearl's arm. The stranger stepped fully into the light. His boots made deliberate sounds against the wooden floor as he approached, stopping only when he stood a few paces from Jenkins and Pearl. "She's worth my whole life," the man said, his voice deep and calm like distant thunder. The saloon fell silent. Even the piano player stopped mid-note. Jenkins scoffed. "What's that supposed to mean, mister?" The stranger's hand rested casually near the revolver at his hip. "It means whatever debt she owes, I'm covering it. And it means you're letting go of her arm before I remove yours from your shoulder." Pearl stared at the man who just claimed her worth exceeded his very existence. He wasn't boasting or threatening, he spoke as if stating a simple fact, like commenting on the weather. "Do you know who I am?" Jenkins snarled, though his grip on Pearl loosened slightly. "A man about to make a wise decision," the stranger replied evenly. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "This should cover any reasonable debt, wagon wheel included." Jenkins eyed the pouch greedily. "Might not be enough." "It is," the stranger said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Unless you'd prefer a different kind of settlement." The way his fingers twitched near his revolver made his meaning clear. A tense moment passed before Jenkins released Pearl's arm with a shove. "Take her, probably more trouble than she's worth anyway." The stranger caught Pearl before she could stumble, his touch gentle but firm. He tossed the pouch to Jenkins, who snatched it from the air with a scowl. "Pleasure doing business," the stranger said, guiding Pearl toward the door. "Wait," Pearl whispered, digging in her heels. "I don't even know you." He tipped his hat back slightly, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. A faint scar traced his jawline. "Wade Reynolds, madam. And I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere less hostile." "Why would you do this?" "I can't repay you," Wade's eyes softened. "Let's just say I've got my reasons. Do you want to stay here with them, or would you like to leave with me?" Pearl glanced back at Jenkins and his companions, who were already arguing over the contents of the pouch. The decision wasn't difficult. "Lead the way, Mr. Reynolds." Outside, the snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, muffling the sounds of the town. Wade led Pearl to a sturdy bay gelding tied to the hitching post. "Can you ride?" he asked, untying the reins. Pearl nodded. Growing up on a farm had ensured she could handle horses since childhood. Wade helped her into the saddle before mounting behind her. The proximity to this stranger should have frightened Pearl, but after what she'd just escaped, his solid presence at her back felt more like protection than threat. "Where are we going?" she asked as they rode slowly through the snow-covered street. "I've got a place about 3 miles out of town." "You'll be safe there tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out what you want to do next." As they left Broken Creek behind, Pearl found herself wondering what kind of man declared a stranger worth his whole life, then backed it up with gold and the threat of violence. And more puzzling still, why. The snow continued to fall as they rode into the darkness, leaving only a single set of hoofprints in their wake, already being erased by the relentless white powder from above. Wade's cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was modest but solidly built, with smoke curling from the stone chimney. As they approached, Pearl could see the warm glow of firelight through the single window. "It's not much," Wade said as he helped her dismount, "but it's dry and warm." Pearl's legs felt unsteady after the ride. She stumbled slightly, and Wade's strong hands caught her elbows, steadying her. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. In the moonlight, she could see the details of his face more clearly, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the strong set of his jaw beneath several days' worth of stubble. "Let me take care of the horse first," Wade said, stepping back. "Go on inside and warm yourself by the fire." The cabin's interior was as simple as its exterior suggested: a single room with a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a small cookstove, and a stone fireplace where flames danced merrily. Despite its sparseness, the cabin felt lived in and cared for. A few books were stacked on a crude shelf, and dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Pearl stood by the fire, extending her cold hands toward the warmth. She heard Wade enter behind her, stamping snow from his boots. "Your things are looking after," he said, hanging his coat and hat on a peg by the door. "Are you hungry?" As if in answer, Pearl's stomach growled audibly. She hadn't eaten since the previous day. Wade smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his serious face, softening the hard edges. "I'll take that as a yes. I've got some stew I can heat up." While Wade busied himself at the stove, Pearl took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. His clothes were worn but clean denims, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. "Why did you help me?" Pearl asked abruptly. Wade paused in his stirring of the pot. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "You gave those men gold. You don't even know me." "I know enough," he returned to his stirring. "I know you were in trouble. I know 3 men against 1 woman aren't fair odds. But you said—" Pearl hesitated. "You said I was worth your whole life. That's a strange thing to say to a stranger." Wade was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes words are just tools. I needed something that would make them stop and listen." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "It worked, didn't it?" Pearl wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded anyway. "My name is Pearl Foster, by the way. I should have introduced myself earlier." "Pearl," Wade repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "It suits you." They ate the stew in companionable silence. It was simple fare rabbit with potatoes and wild onions, but to Pearl's empty stomach, it tasted better than any fine restaurant meal. "You mentioned your father," Wade said as they finished eating. "Jenkins said something about his debts." Pearl's hands tightened around her bowl. "My father died 3 weeks ago, pneumonia, before the end, he told me he'd borrowed money from Jenkins for seed last spring after the flood washed away our first planting. The harvest wasn't good enough to pay it back." She swallowed hard. "I didn't know how much he owed until Jenkins came calling. It was more than everything we had left combined. And your mother died when I was 12. It's been just me and Pa for a long time." Pearl set her empty bowl on the table. "The bank took the farm last week. I've been staying at the boarding house in town, but my money ran out yesterday. I was trying to find work when Jenkins found me." Wade nodded slowly. "And no other family, none that would claim me," Pearl said with a bitter smile. "My mother's people disowned her when she married my father. They thought he was beneath them." Wade collected their bowls and set them in a basin of water. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Pearl immediately protested. I can't put you out of your own bed. You're not putting me out, I'm offering. His tone brooked no argument. There are some of my mother's old things in that trunk by the bed. Might be something you can wear to sleep in. Pearl wanted to refuse, to insist she wasn't a charity case, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. Just for tonight, she conceded. And tomorrow I'll find a way to repay you. Wade's expression softened. We'll worry about tomorrow when it comes. Get some rest, Pearl. Later, dressed in a borrowed nightgown that was too large for her slender frame, Pearl lay in Wade's bed listening to his steady breathing from his makeshift pallet by the fire. The events of the day swirled in her mind how close she had come to a fate worse than death, and how this stranger had stepped in and changed everything with a handful of gold and 7 words. She's worth my whole life. Why would he say that? What had made him walk into that saloon at that precise moment? Pearl had never been one to believe in divine intervention, but it was hard to see Wade's appearance as mere coincidence. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin, Pearl felt safe for the first time since her father had drawn his last labored breath. With that comforting thought, she finally drifted into a dreamless sleep. Morning arrived with clear skies and brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling wonderland. Pearl woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Wade moving quietly around the cabin. Good morning, he said when he noticed her stirring. Hope I didn't wake you. Pearl sat up, gathering the quilt around her shoulders. No, I usually rise with the sun, old farm habits. Wade nodded in understanding as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Thought we might ride into town today, get you some proper things. Can't have you wearing my mother's old nightgown forever. I can't accept any more from you, Pearl said firmly. You've already done too much. Wade handed her a cup of coffee. Consider it a loan then. You can pay me back when you're on your feet. Pearl accepted the coffee but shook her head. And how exactly am I supposed to get on my feet? I have no home, no family, no prospects. You could stay here, Wade said casually, as if offering temporary shelter to strange women was something he did regularly. At least until spring. No sense in trying to travel far with winter setting in. Pearl stared at him over the rim of her cup. Stay here, with you, a man I just met. What would people think? A ghost of a smile crossed Wade's face. If you're worried about your reputation, my nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. No one would know. I would know, Pearl countered. And besides, you haven't explained why you're doing all this. Why you walked into that saloon yesterday. Why you said what you did. Wade's expression grew serious. Get dressed. I want to show you something. Curious despite her misgivings, Pearl changed into her own clothes from the previous day. They were worn and travel-stained, but they were hers. Wade waited for her by the door, already dressed in his coat and hat. It's not far, but we'll take the horse. Ground's treacherous with the snow. They rode double again, Pearl sitting behind Wade this time, her arms tentatively circling his waist to keep her balance. They followed a narrow trail through the trees for about 10 minutes before emerging into another small clearing. In the center stood a wooden cross. Wade stopped the horse and dismounted, then helped Pearl down. Without a word, he led her to the cross. As they drew closer, Pearl could make out a name carved into the wood, Elizabeth Reynolds. Your wife, Pearl asked softly. Wade nodded, his eyes fixed on the cross. And my son. They're both buried here. Pearl felt a wave of sorrow for this quiet man standing beside her. I'm so sorry. It was 5 years ago, Wade said, his voice steady but distant, as if he were reciting a story he'd told many times. Elizabeth was with child, there were complications. By the time I got her to town, it was too late for both of them. Pearl didn't know what to say, so she remained silent, giving him space to continue if he wished. Before she died, Wade went on after a moment, she made me promise something. She said, don't let your heart turn cold, Wade. Help someone who needs it the way I needed you once. He turned to face Pearl, his blue eyes intense. Yesterday, when I walked into that saloon and saw you surrounded by those men, I heard Elizabeth's voice in my head, clear as day. It was the first time since she died that I felt certain about anything. Pearl's throat tightened with emotion. So when you said I was worth your whole life, I meant that helping you was worth honoring the promise I made to her. Wade's gaze didn't waver. I don't expect anything from you, Pearl. But I'm offering you safe harbor until you decide what you want to do next. No strings attached. Pearl looked at the simple cross, then back at the man standing before her, a man grieving a loss she could scarcely imagine, yet still finding the capacity to help a stranger. "Thank you," she said simply. "I accept your offer, but only until I can find work and a place of my own." Wade nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "That's fair." They stood in silence for a few moments longer, paying respects to the woman whose final wish had brought them together in such unexpected circumstances. As they rode back to the cabin, Pearl found herself wondering what kind of woman Elizabeth Reynolds had been to inspire such devotion even after death. And she wondered, too, what kind of man Wade had been before grief had carved its lines into his face. The days settled into a routine. Wade would rise before dawn to tend to his small herd of cattle and the 2 horses he kept. Pearl took over the domestic duties without being asked, cooking, cleaning, mending. It wasn't much different from what she'd done all her life, but here in this small cabin, it felt less like drudgery and more like contributing to a shared existence. They rode into town once a week for supplies. Wade purchased fabric and notions so Pearl could make herself some new clothes. He insisted it was a practical expense, not charity, since her old dress was barely holding together. As promised, Wade made no inappropriate advances. He continued to sleep on his pallet by the fire, despite Pearl's occasional insistence that they could alternate using the bed. "A man doesn't put a lady out of a proper bed," was all he would say on the matter. December turned to January, and the winter deepened its grip on the Montana territory. The snow piled high around the cabin, and on many days, venturing further than the barn was impossible. During these long, isolated days, Wade and Pearl began to truly talk to each other. Pearl learned that Wade had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, seeking a fresh start. He'd fought for the Union, though he spoke little of those years. He'd met Elizabeth in a small town in Kansas, where her father ran the general store. They'd married quickly and headed further west, eventually settling on this piece of land 3 years before her death. In turn, Pearl told Wade about growing up on the farm, about her mother's refined manners that hinted at her more genteel upbringing, and about her father's determined optimism even in the face of repeated hardships. "He always believed next year would be better," Pearl said one evening as they sat by the fire, she sewing, he whittling a piece of pine. "Even when the locusts came, even when the river flooded, even when the drought burned the crops in the field. Next year," he'd say, "next year we'll turn the corner." "Sounds like a man who didn't give up easily," Wade observed. "No, he didn't," Pearl agreed with a sad smile. "Except on himself at the end, when he realized he couldn't pay Jenkins back, something in him just broke. I think he was more afraid of leaving me with that debt than he was of dying." Wade's hands stilled on his carving, "And yet that's exactly what happened." "Yes," Pearl said softly, "though I suppose it worked out in an unexpected way." She glanced up at him. "If not for that debt, I wouldn't be here now." Their eyes met across the small space, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. January gave way to February, and with it came Pearl's 21st birthday. She mentioned it casually the day before, not expecting anything, but Wade surprised her by producing a small package wrapped in brown paper the next morning. "It isn't much," he said gruffly as he handed it to her. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. Pearl opened it to find it empty, waiting for memories to fill it. "It was my mother's," Wade explained. "Elizabeth kept it in her jewelry box but never wore it, said it was waiting for the right person." Pearl's fingers trembled as she held the beautiful piece. "I can't accept this. It's too valuable, too personal." "You can and you will," Wade insisted gently. "Elizabeth would have wanted you to have it. She was always giving things away to people who needed a bit of beauty in their lives." With tears threatening to spill from her eyes, Pearl turned and lifted her hair. "Will you help me put it on?" Wade's fingers were surprisingly nimble as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck. His touch lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, sending a shiver down Pearl's spine that had nothing to do with the winter chill. "Thank you," she whispered, turning back to face him. "No one has given me anything so lovely since my mother died." Wade's eyes were soft as they rested on her face. "It suits you," he said, echoing his words from their first night in the cabin. But this time, the simple phrase carried a weight of meaning that made Pearl's heart beat faster. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a pot of coffee, Pearl found herself studying Wade's profile. The firelight cast shadows that softened the lines of his face, making him look younger, more like the man he might have been before tragedy had marked him. "Tell me about her," Pearl said suddenly. "About Elizabeth, what was she like?" Wade looked surprised by the request, but after a moment's hesitation, he began to speak. "She was full of life, always laughing, always seeing the bright side of things. She could charm a smile out of anyone, even the sourest old coot in town." A fond smile touched his lips at the memory. "She loved to sing, though she couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, and she was braver than me in many ways. Moving out here to the middle of nowhere didn't frighten her one bit." "She sounds wonderful," Pearl said sincerely. "She was." Wade's smile faded. "For a long time after she died, I couldn't bear to think about her without feeling like I was being torn apart inside. It was easier to just not feel anything." "And now?" Pearl asked softly. Wade turned to look directly at her. "Now I find I can remember the good without being crushed by the bad. I think that's probably what she would have wanted." Pearl nodded, understanding all too well the complicated process of grief. "My mother used to say that as long as we remember people, they're never truly gone." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Pearl agreed. Then, feeling suddenly bold, she added, "I think she would have liked you." Wade's expression was unreadable in the flickering light. "And what about you, Pearl Foster? What do you think of me?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with potential. Pearl's heart hammered in her chest as she considered her answer. "I think you're a good man, Wade Reynolds," she said finally. "A better man than most I've known." Something flickered in Wade's eyes: disappointment, relief. Pearl couldn't tell. But the moment passed, and they returned to their comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire slowly died to embers. February brought with it an unexpected thaw. For nearly a week, the temperature rose enough to melt much of the snow, turning the path to town muddy but passable. Wade announced they should take advantage of the weather to stock up on supplies. In town, Pearl noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed them as they moved from the general store to the feed merchant. Clearly, her continued presence at Wade's cabin had not gone unremarked, despite the distance from town. "People are talking," she murmured to Wade as they loaded their purchases onto the wagon he'd borrowed from a neighbor. "People always talk," he replied with a shrug. "It doesn't matter what they say. It matters to me," Pearl insisted. "I don't want them thinking things about you, about us." Wade paused in his work, giving her a long look. "What is it you think they're saying exactly?" Pearl felt her cheeks flush. That we're improper." To her surprise, Wade laughed a genuine, full-bodied laugh that she had rarely heard from him. "Pearl Foster, you've been living in my cabin for 2 months, and I've spent every night sleeping on the floor by the fire. If anything, they're probably wondering what's wrong with me." Pearl couldn't help but smile at his frank assessment. "Well, when you put it that way." Their good humor was short-lived. As they prepared to leave town, a familiar figure stepped into their path. Lyle Jenkins, flanked by his 2 companions from the saloon. Well, Jenkins drawled, his eyes moving from Wade to Pearl with a knowing leer. "If it ain't the high-priced farm girl and her devoted cowboy." Wade's posture shifted subtly, his hand moving closer to his sidearm. "We don't want trouble, Jenkins." "Funny thing about trouble," Jenkins replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "It has a way of finding certain folks." His gaze fixed on Pearl. "Like people who think they can just walk away from their obligations." "Her debt was paid," Wade said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You took my gold, we're square." Jenkins chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. Maybe not. "Been thinking about it, and I'm not sure a wagon wheel's worth was enough after all." Pearl felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. "The agreement was made," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You accepted his payment." "Under duress," Jenkins countered. "Man pulls a gun on you, you tend to agree to things you might not otherwise." I never pulled my gun, Wade pointed out, though his hand remained near it. Near enough, Jenkins said with a shrug. Point is, I'm feeling shortchanged. Several townspeople had stopped to watch the confrontation, their expressions ranging from concern to morbid fascination. What do you want, Jenkins? Wade asked bluntly. Just what's fair, Jenkins replied. The girl was collateral for her daddy's debt. Gold's nice, but I'm thinking maybe I should have held out for something more substantial. His eyes raked over Pearl in a way that made her skin crawl. In one fluid motion, Wade stepped between them. That's not happening. Not now, not ever. Jenkins' hand moved toward his own gun. You willing to die over it? She's worth my whole life, Wade repeated, the same words he'd spoken in the saloon 2 months earlier. But this time, Pearl heard something different in his tone, not just determination, but a depth of feeling that made her breath catch. A tense silence fell over the street. Pearl could see the calculation in Jenkins' eyes as he assessed Wade's stance, his resolve. Finally, Jenkins spat again and took a step back. Ain't worth getting shot over, he muttered. But this ain't the end of it, Reynolds. You watch your back. And you watch yours, Wade replied evenly. Jenkins and his companions moved off, leaving Wade and Pearl standing by the wagon, the curious eyes of the townspeople still upon them. Let's go home, Wade said quietly, helping Pearl up onto the wagon seat. As they left town behind, Pearl found herself replaying Wade's words in her mind. She's worth my whole life. The first time, he'd explained it as a tool, a phrase designed to make Jenkins stop and listen. But this time it had sounded like truth. They were halfway back to the cabin when Wade finally broke the silence. I'm sorry about that. I should have expected Jenkins might still be holding a grudge. It's not your fault, Pearl assured him. If anything, I'm the one who should be apologizing. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door since the moment we met. Wade glanced at her, his expression softening. That's not true, Pearl, isn't it? If not for me, you wouldn't have had to face down Jenkins twice. You wouldn't have had to give up your gold or your bed, or if not for you, Wade interrupted gently. I'd still be existing, not living, going through the motions day after day without really feeling anything. He returned his gaze to the road ahead. You've brought more than trouble to my door, Pearl Foster. You've brought life back to it. Pearl felt tears prickling behind her eyes at his simple honesty. I don't know what to say to that. You don't have to say anything, Wade assured her. Just know that I don't regret a single moment since I walked into that saloon and saw you standing there. The warmth that bloomed in Pearl's chest at his words had nothing to do with the unseasonable weather. It was something deeper, something she had felt growing between them over the long winter months but had been afraid to acknowledge, even to herself. That evening, as they unloaded the supplies and settled back into the cabin, Pearl found herself watching Wade with new eyes. She noticed the careful way he moved, the strength in his hands as he stacked firewood, the occasional glances he cast in her direction when he thought she wasn't looking. After supper, as they sat by the fire engaged in their usual evening activities, Pearl mending a shirt, Wade reading one of his few books, she finally gathered the courage to speak what was on her mind. Did you mean it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What you said to Jenkins today. Wade looked up from his book, his blue eyes serious. Which part? That I'm worth your whole life. Pearl's fingers stilled on her sewing. Did you mean it literally this time, or was it still just words? Wade closed his book carefully and set it aside. For a long moment, he simply looked at her as if weighing his response. I meant it, he said finally. Both times, Pearl's heart leapt. But you said I know what I said, Wade interrupted gently. And it was true as far as it went. When I walked into that saloon, I was thinking of my promise to Elizabeth. But even then, there was something about you that. He trailed off, seemingly struggling for words. That what? Pearl prompted softly. Wade ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or nervousness that Pearl had come to recognize. That made me want to know you, to protect you, to be the man who could help you. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. I told myself it was just about keeping my promise, that I was helping you because it's what Elizabeth would have wanted, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Pearl set her mending aside and rose to join him at the window. What is the whole truth, Wade? He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw a vulnerability that he rarely allowed to show. "The whole truth is that I've spent 5 years half alive, and then you came into my life and reminded me what it feels like to care about tomorrow, to want things again." His voice dropped to nearly a whisper. To feel my heart beating for something other than just duty or memory. Pearl's own heart was racing now. "Wade, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not expecting anything from you. I know you'll want to move on when spring comes properly, find your own way, and that's as it should be. You're young, Pearl, you have your whole life ahead of you." "What if I don't want to move on?" Pearl asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What if I've found something here that I don't want to leave behind?" Wade's eyes widened slightly. "Pearl, you don't have to. I'm not saying this out of gratitude or obligation," she cut him off firmly. "I'm saying it because over these past months I've come to know you, Wade Reynolds. I've seen your kindness, your strength, your integrity. I've seen the man you are when no one else is watching." She took a deep breath. "And I've found myself falling in love with that man." The confession hung in the air between them, irrevocable. For a terrifying moment, Pearl thought she had misread everything, that Wade's feelings for her were merely protective, not romantic. Then he closed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her face in his hands with exquisite gentleness. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because if you're not," Pearl silenced him by rising on her tiptoes and pressing her lips to his. It was a brief, chaste kiss, but it carried the weight of everything they'd left unspoken. When she drew back, Wade's eyes were closed, his expression one of wonder. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "I love you, Pearl Foster," he said simply. "God help me, I've tried not to, but I do." Pearl smiled through the tears that had begun to fall. "And I love you, Wade Reynolds." He gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. Pearl rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the promise of more snow. But inside the small cabin, a different kind of promise was being made, one of love, of companionship, of a future neither of them had dared to imagine just a few months before. The following weeks brought a return of winter's full fury. The brief thaw was replaced by blizzards that kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. But where such isolation might once have been tedious, Pearl and Wade found in it a precious opportunity to explore their newfound feelings for each other. They spoke of the future tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Wade proposed they marry in the spring, when travel to the nearest town with a proper church would be possible. Pearl accepted without hesitation. "It won't be an easy life," Wade warned her one evening as they lay together before the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. "Ranching is hard work, and we're a long way from anywhere." Pearl smiled up at him. "I grew up on a farm, remember? I'm no stranger to hard work." She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip. "Besides, I think we've both had enough of easy versus hard. What matters is whether it's worth it." Wade caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You're worth everything, Pearl, everything." March arrived with the first real signs that winter's grip was loosening. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. Birds returned, filling the morning air with song. And with the changing of the seasons came a change in their circumstances as well. Wade rode into town alone one day to mail a letter to the circuit preacher, arranging for him to perform their wedding ceremony when he next came through the area. While there, he encountered Emmett Doyle, the shorter of Jenkins' companions from the saloon confrontation. "Jenkins is planning something," Doyle told him, glancing nervously over his shoulder as they stood outside the general store. "He's been drinking heavy and talking about settling scores." "Thought you ought to know." Wade thanked him for the warning, wondering at the man's unexpected consideration. "Don't thank me," Doyle said, already backing away. "Just watch yourself and keep that girl of yours close." The warning cast a shadow over Wade's return to the cabin. He debated whether to tell Pearl, not wanting to frighten her but also needing her to be vigilant. In the end, honesty prevailed. "Jenkins is still nursing his grudge," he told her that evening. "We need to be careful for a while." Pearl's face paled slightly, but she nodded with determination. We will be together. They established new precautions. Wade taught Pearl how to use his spare revolver, though she proved to be a reluctant student. I don't like guns, she admitted after their first lesson, but I'll learn if it means keeping us safe. Neither of them ventured far from the cabin alone. When chores required them to separate, they maintained visual contact whenever possible. At night, Wade positioned his rifle within easy reach of the bed they now shared as husband and wife in all but legal status. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. The tension began to ease, and they dared to hope that perhaps Jenkins' threats were merely drunken bluster. Then came the morning when Wade went to the barn to feed the livestock and found the door ajar. Inside, his cattle and one of his horses lay dead, their throats cut. On the barn wall, someone had used the animal's blood to write a crude message, "You're next." Wade managed to keep Pearl from seeing the worst of it, but he couldn't hide the fact that they were under direct threat. That night, they took turns keeping watch, though neither slept much. "We could leave," Pearl suggested as dawn broke, casting pale light through the cabin windows. "Go somewhere Jenkins won't find us." Wade shook his head. "This is our home. I won't be driven from it by the likes of him." He took her hands in his. "But if you want to go, I understand. I could take you to the next town over where my cousin lives. You'd be safe there until this is settled." Pearl's grip tightened on his hands. "My place is with you. If this is our home, then I'll fight for it too." The attack came 3 days later, just as dusk was settling over the land. Wade was checking the perimeter of their property, rifle in hand, when the first shot rang out. The bullet splintered wood from a fence post near his head. He dropped to the ground, scanning the tree line for the shooter. A movement caught his eye, a flash of color among the brown and green. Wade fired in that direction and was rewarded with a cry of pain. More shots followed from multiple directions. Wade realized with growing dread that Jenkins hadn't come alone. He needed to get back to the cabin to Pearl. Moving in a low crouch, using whatever cover he could find, Wade worked his way toward home. He was halfway there when he heard Pearl scream. Cold fear gripped his heart. Abandoning caution, Wade ran the remaining distance, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet tear into his back. But he reached the cabin unharmed, bursting through the door with his rifle ready. The scene inside froze his blood. Jenkins stood in the center of the room, holding Pearl by her hair, a knife at her throat. Blood trickled from a cut on her temple. "Drop the rifle," Jenkins ordered. "Or I cut her pretty neck." Wade lowered his weapon slowly to the floor, his eyes never leaving Pearl's. Her expression was terrified but resolute. "Let her go, Jenkins," Wade said, struggling to keep his voice level. "This is between you and me," Jenkins laughed. "Not anymore, it ain't. Not since you made her more valuable than a wagon wheel." He yanked Pearl's hair harder, making her gasp. "Turns out you were right about her worth. Spent these months thinking about it, and I decided I want her after all, plus whatever else you got worth taking." "Take whatever you want," Wade said, hands raised in surrender. "Just don't hurt her." "Oh, I'm taking what I want," Jenkins sneered, "starting with watching you die slow while she watches." He nodded to someone behind Wade. Too late, Wade realized his mistake in focusing solely on Jenkins and Pearl. Pain exploded in the back of his head as something hard connected with his skull. He fell to his knees, his vision swimming. Through the haze of pain, he heard Pearl cry out his name. Then another blow landed, and darkness claimed him. Wade regained consciousness to the sensation of cold water being thrown in his face. He gasped, choking and sputtering as his senses slowly returned. He was tied to one of the kitchen chairs, his arms secured behind his back, his ankles bound to the chair legs. Jenkins stood before him, still holding Pearl, though he'd moved the knife from her throat to rest against her cheek. 2 other men, not Doyle, Wade noted dimly, stood nearby, both armed with revolvers. "Welcome back," Jenkins said with a cruel smile. "Didn't want you to miss the fun." Wade tested his bonds subtly, finding them distressingly secure. "Whatever you're planning, Jenkins, it's not too late to walk away. Kill me if you have to, but let Pearl go." "That's mighty generous of you," Jenkins mocked, "but I got plans for both of you." He stroked Pearl's cheek with the flat of his blade, "especially this one." Pearl's eyes met Wade's, and in them he saw not just fear but determination. She gave him the slightest of nods, a signal he understood immediately. She was ready to fight. Wade's mind raced, assessing their options. The odds were poor 3 armed men against him, bound and injured, and Pearl, who despite her courage had little experience with violence. But they had one advantage: Jenkins and his men believed they had won. They were getting careless, overconfident. "You know," Wade said conversationally, "for a man so concerned about debts, you don't seem to understand the concept very well." Jenkins frowned. "What are you babbling about?" "A debt is something owed, something of value." Wade kept his tone casual, trying to draw Jenkins' focus away from Pearl. "But you're not owed anything here. You took my gold. The debt was paid." "Maybe I decided the interest was higher than expected," Jenkins snarled. Wade shrugged as much as his bonds would allow. "Then you're not collecting a debt. You're just a common thief and a coward hiding behind a woman." Jenkins' face darkened with rage. "I'll show you who's a coward." He shoved Pearl toward one of his men. "Hold her." The man grabbed Pearl roughly, but as he did, she stumbled deliberately, throwing him off balance. In the moment of confusion, she drove her elbow hard into his stomach. Simultaneously, Wade threw his weight backward, tipping his chair over with a crash. The impact sent pain shooting through his shoulders, but it also put him temporarily out of Jenkins' direct line of sight. Jenkins bellowed in anger, lunging toward Wade with his knife raised. But Pearl, having momentarily broken free, seized a pot from the stove and swung it with all her might, connecting squarely with the back of Jenkins' head. The blow didn't knock him out, but it staggered him long enough for Wade to roll, chair and all, toward the fireplace. Ignoring the pain, he maneuvered until he could reach the poker that leaned against the hearth. The second man raised his gun toward Pearl, but Wade managed to hook the poker with his bound hands and fling it with desperate accuracy. It struck the man's arm, sending his shot wide. Pearl dove for Wade's rifle, which still lay where he had dropped it by the door. She grabbed it, rolled onto her back, and aimed it at the first man, who was recovering from her elbow strike. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice shaking but determined. Jenkins, regaining his senses, turned toward her with murder in his eyes. The sound of a shotgun being cocked interrupted whatever vile thing he had been about to say. Everyone in the room froze. In the doorway stood Emmett Doyle, holding a sawed-off shotgun pointed directly at Jenkins. "That's enough, Lyle," Doyle said, his voice unusually firm. Jenkins stared at him in disbelief. "Emmett, what the hell are you doing?" "Something I should have done a long time ago," Doyle replied. "Put the knife down and step away from them. You're taking their side," Jenkins snarled. "After all we've been through," Doyle's expression remained resolute. "I'm taking the side of what's right, for once in my miserable life." He gestured with the shotgun. "Now drop the knife." For a tense moment, it seemed Jenkins might refuse. Then with a curse, he let the blade clatter to the floor. "You two as well," Doyle instructed the other men. "Guns on the floor, nice and easy." They complied, clearly recognizing the futility of resistance against a shotgun at close range. "Now untie him," Doyle ordered, nodding toward Wade. Once freed, Wade moved immediately to Pearl's side, checking her injuries. The cut on her temple had stopped bleeding, and besides some bruising, she appeared physically unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, cradling her face in his hands. Pearl nodded, tears of relief filling her eyes. "I am now." Wade turned to Doyle, who was still covering Jenkins and the others with his shotgun. "Why?" he asked simply. Doyle's gaze remained fixed on his former companions. "Had a sister once. Lot like your Pearl there, strong-willed, brave." His expression hardened. "Jenkins and his kind took her from me. Been trying to convince myself it didn't matter, that I couldn't have stopped it, but watching him plan to do the same to another woman." He shook his head. "Couldn't stand by this time." "Thank you," Pearl said with quiet sincerity. Doyle acknowledged her words with a slight nod. "Sheriff's on his way. Stopped by his office before I followed these jackals out here." Sure enough, within the hour, the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies. Jenkins and his men were arrested for attempted murder, kidnapping, and destruction of property. Doyle, despite his previous association with Jenkins, was treated as a key witness rather than an accomplice. As the lawman led the prisoners away, the sheriff paused beside Wade and Pearl, who stood together on the porch of their cabin, his arm protectively around her shoulders. "You two all right?" the sheriff asked, his weathered face concerned. Wade looked down at Pearl, who gave him a tired but genuine smile. "We will be," he answered. Later that night, after the chaos had subsided and they were finally alone, Wade held Pearl close in their bed, marveling at her courage. "You were incredible," he murmured against her hair. "The way you fought back," Pearl sighed, nestling closer to his warmth. "I was terrified, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." "We're going to be all right now," Wade assured her, though part of him still found it hard to believe the danger had truly passed. "Jenkins will be going to prison for a long time." "I know." Pearl was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said to him, about me being worth your whole life." Wade's arms tightened around her. "I meant it, every word." "I know that too." She raised herself up on one elbow to look into his face. "But Wade, you're worth my whole life as well. Today proved that to me. I would do anything to protect what we have together." Wade felt a lump form in his throat at her words. "I don't deserve you, Pearl Foster." She smiled, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Soon to be Pearl Reynolds. And yes, you do deserve me. We deserve each other and the happiness we've found." As Wade kissed her, he silently thanked whatever twist of fate had led him to walk into that saloon on that snowy December day. He had gone there seeking nothing more than a drink and a meal, and instead had found the woman who would become his reason for living again. The circuit preacher arrived 2 weeks later, and Wade and Pearl were married in a simple ceremony attended by a handful of neighbors, the sheriff and his wife, and somewhat surprisingly, Emmett Doyle, who stood awkwardly at the back until Pearl insisted he join the small gathering properly. "Never thought I'd see the day," the sheriff remarked to Wade after the ceremony. "You were like a ghost these past years, just going through the motions. Good to see you among the living again." Wade smiled, his eyes finding Pearl across the room where she was chatting animatedly with the sheriff's wife. "She brought me back," he said simply. Spring bloomed fully across the Montana territory, bringing with it new life and new beginnings. Wade and Pearl worked side by side to rebuild their small herd, using some of the money Wade had saved over the years. They expanded the garden, Pearl applying the farming knowledge she'd gained from her father to grow vegetables and herbs. In late April, they rode together to visit Elizabeth's grave. Pearl had suggested it, feeling it important to acknowledge the woman whose final wish had, in a roundabout way, brought them together. Wade placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the wooden cross, his expression solemn but peaceful. "I think she would have liked you," he said quietly to Pearl, who stood respectfully nearby. "You have the same kind of spirit, the same way of seeing beauty in simple things." Pearl moved to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "I wish I could have known her. In a way you do," Wade replied, "through the parts of me that she helped shape." He squeezed Pearl's hand. "Just as I feel I know your parents through you, through the strength and kindness they instilled in you." They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, honoring the dead while celebrating the life they were building together. As summer approached, Pearl discovered she was with child. The news filled Wade with a complex mixture of joy and terror, given what had happened to Elizabeth. But Pearl's quiet confidence helped ease his fears. "This is a new beginning," she told him firmly. "Not a repetition of the past, we have to believe that." And Wade did believe it, more with each passing day as Pearl's body changed, nurturing the new life growing within her. They converted a corner of the cabin into a nursery, Wade crafting a cradle from pine harvested from their own land. Autumn came, painting the landscape in golds and reds. Pearl's belly grew round, and Wade found himself marveling at the miracle of it, all how close he had come to missing this, to spending the rest of his days in lonely isolation. "What are you thinking about?" Pearl asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Wade smiled, placing his hand gently on her swollen abdomen. "I'm thinking about worth," he said. "About how we measure the value of things, of people, of moments like this." Pearl covered his hand with her own. "And what have you concluded? That Jenkins was wrong about everything, but especially about you." Wade's voice grew husky with emotion. "You're not worth a wagon wheel or a pouch of gold or even my whole life." Pearl raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "You're worth immeasurably more," Wade said softly. "You're worth everything this world has to offer and then some. You're worth every sunrise and sunset, every star in the sky, every breath I take." Tears glistened in Pearl's eyes as she leaned forward to kiss him. "As are you to me, Wade Reynolds. As are you to me." Their daughter was born on the first snowfall of winter, exactly 1 year from the day Wade and Pearl had first met. They named her Elizabeth Hope Reynolds Elizabeth, for the woman whose dying wish had set everything in motion, and hope for what she represented to both of them. As Wade held his tiny daughter, marveling at her perfect fingers and the wisp of dark hair that already covered her head, he felt a sense of completion he had never thought to experience again. Beside him, Pearl watched with tired eyes that nonetheless shone with love and pride. "She's beautiful," Wade whispered, afraid to speak too loudly lest he shatter the perfect moment. "She is," Pearl agreed. "And she's ours." Wade carefully placed the baby in Pearl's arms, then sat on the edge of the bed, encompassing both his wife and daughter in a gentle embrace. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the land in a blanket of pristine white. But inside the small cabin, warmth and love prevailed, creating a haven against the winter's chill. In the years that followed, the Reynolds family prospered. Wade expanded his cattle operation, eventually building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Elizabeth was joined by a brother, William, 2 years later, and then by another sister, Margaret, 2 years after that. Pearl's garden expanded into a small orchard, producing apples and cherries that she preserved for winter use and sold in town during the harvest season. Her preserves became famous throughout the county, earning her a modest income of her own. Emmett Doyle became a regular visitor to their home, eventually settling on a small plot of land nearby. He never married, but he became Uncle Emmett to the Reynolds children, teaching them to fish and telling them sanitized versions of his adventures. As for Lyle Jenkins, he served 8 years in the territorial prison before being released. He left Montana shortly thereafter, reportedly heading for California. Wade kept a watchful eye for several months after hearing of his release, but Jenkins never returned to Broken Creek. On their 10th anniversary, Wade presented Pearl with a special gift, a locket, to replace the one he had given her on her birthday all those years ago. This one was gold rather than silver, and when Pearl opened it, she found a miniature portrait of Wade on one side and their 3 children on the other. "To replace the empty one," Wade explained as Pearl admired it with tears in her eyes. "Though I suppose the first one wasn't really empty after all. It was just waiting to be filled with our memories." Pearl fastened the new locket around her neck, where it nestled alongside the silver one she had never stopped wearing. "I'll treasure them both," she said. "Just as I treasure the life we've built together." That evening, after the children were asleep, Pearl and Wade sat on the porch of their home, much as they had done countless times before. The landscape before them had changed over the years. The small cabin was now a proper ranch house. The meager herd had grown substantial. Fences and outbuildings marked the boundaries of their prosperity. But some things remained constant: the vast Montana sky, the distant mountains, and most importantly, the love between them that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Do you ever think about it?" Pearl asked, her head resting on Wade's shoulder as they rocked gently in the porch swing he had built for her birthday several years earlier. "About how it all started," Wade's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Often," he admitted. "Though sometimes it feels like a story that happened to someone else. The idea that there was ever a time when you weren't part of my life." Pearl smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "I was thinking today about what Jenkins said, about me being worth a wagon wheel." Wade stiffened slightly at the mention of the man who had nearly destroyed their happiness. That man never understood true worth. "No, he didn't," Pearl agreed, "but in a strange way I'm almost grateful for his terrible assessment." Wade looked down at her, puzzled. "Grateful?" Pearl nodded. "If he hadn't tried to sell me for a wagon wheel, you might never have stepped in to say I was worth your whole life." She reached up to touch his face gently. "And I might never have discovered that you were worth mine." Wade turned to press a kiss into her palm. a gesture that had become familiar over their years together, but had lost none of its tenderness. I suppose even the worst circumstances can lead to the greatest blessings, if we're brave enough to recognize them. And brave enough to fight for them, Pearl added, thinking of all they had overcome together. From inside the house came the soft cry of their youngest child, Margaret, likely stirring from a bad dream. "I'll go," Wade said, rising from the swing. "You rest." Pearl watched him disappear into the house, marveling as she often did at how completely this one man had changed the course of her life. What might have been her end, being sold for a wagon wheel to settle her father's debt, had instead become her beginning. As she waited for Wade to return, Pearl's fingers found the two lockets that hung around her neck, the silver one that had once been empty, and the gold one filled with the faces of those she loved most in the world. Together, they represented her journey from that desperate day in the saloon to this moment of profound contentment. Wade returned a few minutes later, settling beside her once more. "Just a nightmare," he reported. "She's already back asleep." Pearl nestled against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Wade," she said softly, "thank you. For checking on Margaret," he asked, sounding slightly confused. Pearl shook her head. "For everything, for walking into that saloon, for saying those words, for loving me." Wade's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. "Pearl Reynolds, loving you isn't something that requires thanks. It's as natural and necessary to me as breathing." As the moon rose over the Montana landscape, casting silver light across the land they had tamed together, Pearl and Wade remained on their porch, wrapped in each other's arms and in the life they had built, a life of love and family, of hard work and sweet rewards. A life worth far more than gold or land or even a perfectly good wagon wheel. A life worth everything.